Thank you, Marek. It's a very nice way to start the day with an introduction like that. And I should also say that I've been terribly impressed by everything I've seen since I arrived in Tallinn, because I have rarely known a conference so large to be organized so effectively, for the atmosphere to be so friendly and non-hierarchical. As one travels in Central and the further east one goes in Europe, one expects to find much more sort of formality because of the still influence, I think, of a certain type of Germanic university style that spread in the 19th century extremely, extremely wide. And to find the sort of, just the sort of very open atmosphere, the very non-hierarchical, people sharing interests, be they an undergraduate, which we have here undergraduates as well as very venerable, indeed ancient professors as well, is something really to cherish. And I'm sure that it's by example. These things only happen by example. So not to confuse excellence with antiquity. And excellence can be found and needs to be fostered everywhere. And I see even on the first row over there, some of the people that are being fostered and nurtured here. And so this whole idea also of involving undergraduates and PhD students as volunteers and so on, I think is not just, it's not sheer exploitation, it is actually an opportunity that is being shared. So for all of that, I shall go back to Queen Mary with some excellent ideas about how to organize our own events. And I must say, I am already looking forward to the next winter school. I'm not trying to get an invitation here. What I mean is I very much hope that our students from London will be able, another deserving group will be able to come and join, because the perspectives that are afforded and the truly wide-ranging interdisciplinarity, after all, interdisciplinarity is often something that's preached rather than practiced. I think the challenges that Marek in organizing this has given each one of us speakers to speak to an audience which includes students of design and students of sociology and anthropology and contemporary religion and whatnot, has been a really an extraordinary challenge, and that's how it ought to be. So let us begin. One of the ways we may think about absence and presence is by aligning them with the material and the immaterial. And indeed, the material turn has been one of the most fruitful preoccupations in contemporary humanities and social sciences. Many of us indeed have encountered, many of you have encountered, of course, and some of us have contributed to this material turn in the humanities. But let us also just remember why it is particularly significant and why particularly it is arising now, because I would have thought that this material turn aims to deal with presence after decades of what seems to have been dealing with abstractions, with discursive frames, with the properties of texts in what seemed to be a manner that ignored materiality and the specific experiences of the people, using them, reading them, being defined by them, and so on. Now, I'm not at all rejecting the traditions of reading that we have learned over the last decades. Indeed, I'm utterly indebted to them. But you can see, situated against the work of recent decades, particularly since the 70s, on textuality, that there was a desire to make texts more material, but also the implications of texts more obviously material. So it's utterly appropriate and enriching now to engage with the objects and indeed, and very importantly, and we haven't mentioned this yet, with sound, if sound is material, but sound is sensed by the senses. So sound is now being taken very seriously, as well as a trace of the past, as a source of knowledge about the past, material and sound, each always the realization, indeed, of some sort of idea, scheme, a plan, or an emotion. For that which is not tangible can, nonetheless, be felt very acutely. Be these non-tangibles the dead, those made to disappear, los desaparecidos, things that are lost or destroyed. Shakespeare's sonnet 73, the famous sonnet 73, made such a reference, which was to echo powerfully for all forms of loss, although it's very specific to his period, as you will see. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare, ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. Those bare, ruined choirs, like this from East Yorkshire, once were part of a sort of, obviously this was part of a medieval Gothic convent whose columns did indeed resemble trees and whose monks had once chanted like sweet birds and were no longer there. But its ruins tell the tale of religious change and political trauma in Shakespeare's England. Ruins, traces, ghosts, and I know there are many ghosts in Tallinn, all link are underground. There is here an expert of ghosts in the room, in fact. Where are you, Kadi? Yes, the expert on ghosts. So places, indeed, that sonnet and ruins like this remind us of ruins, traces, ghosts, all link us to the absent, made present, very present indeed. Ghosts inhabited Shakespeare's play Hamlet too, which, as Stephen Greenblatt has so eloquently taught us, is spurred on by the inability to lay a ghost to rest. Hamlet had no way in Protestant England of his time, Hamlet had no way, as imagined by Shakespeare in Protestant England, to pay the debt and make amends, to ensure the quiet of his father's ghost with prayers in a chapel in a traditional way. And so he was tormented like his father in purgatory until he lost his mind. For centuries earlier, that is, in the centuries before the Reformation, Europeans had devised really very intricate ways of appeasing the dead and remembering them. Some took place in this very city, in Tallinn, Reval. As Estonian historian Anu Mand, who's joined us today, where is she? There she is. There she is too. Has shown, foreign merchants who were from other places but were trading or spent some time in the city, and young ones too, combined in the early 15th century in Livonian cities, not just in Tallinn, in well-endowed religious clubs like the Blackheads of Tallinn and of Riga, and we have here in the room also Gustav Strenge, recently completed his PhD in London, exactly on the Riga experience. So in clubs like this, they provided exactly for that moment when they would become absent, perhaps away from home, perhaps away from family, and so as to ensure that prayer would follow them, prayer and commemoration for their souls after death. Providing for death, engaging with the death, speaking with the dead are all ways of making the absent present and cherished, as well as a manner, of course, of display of virtue and of wealth and of power. One might even say, following Zygmunt Bauman on Monday, that it was a way of being mighty, kräftig, who could, for those who could engage effectively in the work of making absence present. Other types of absence animate religious cultures throughout, and particularly the Abrahamic religions, where God was rendered both almighty and extremely hard to imagine. Indeed, this is a paradox, the paradox of immateriality, that is, the desire to render something immaterial and remove it from the normal rough and tumble of mundane life, and yet this is something that's really hard to achieve, as phrased by Daniel Miller, the anthropologist from London, in his recent book, Materiality, the inherent contradiction that follows from the impossibility of ever transcending the process of objectification itself. So that is the dilemma of any attempt, as we will see in what follows, of making something belong to a different order, to be divine, to be transcendent. The holiest of holies in the temple in Jerusalem was an empty place marked by an ever-burning flame, and yet the deity was served at the very same time in another part of the temple by sacrifices which excited all the senses. The Buddha in early Buddhist art, and I know we have an expert on Buddhism here in the room as well, was represented often by an empty throne, nonetheless very real and suggestive. Emptiness and absence of that which is revered and desired is a palpable experience nonetheless, and it leaves traces of once having been or of being still, like the imprint, I think, of a body on a mattress, which leaves no doubt of the reality of what had once been there. The move then in our inquiries, as it were, and to put it extremely crudely, from ideas to things, still leaves us with the thingness of absence and requires us to learn about how absence begs, requests, demands articulation, depending on genre and on context and on the materials used, of course. Materialization can be widely accepted or extremely divisive. So just to go back to that example of the ruined choirs of Protestant England, who is to interpret the meaning of that absence, looking at the choirs, those ruined choirs would mean very different things to different people. And indeed, even in 2014 of my title, they would prompt very different responses if you were the person in charge of preservation, conservation, bringing school children to see them. What do they actually summon from the past? Some of the ways in which absence is made present is through its extension and incorporation into narrative, through the work of imagination and the emotions poured into narrative. And it's a real special privilege to unfold a little bit about these religious narratives in the absent presence of Mika Ba, who was with us until she had to leave this morning, and more than anyone else has really taught us how to understand narrative. Absence can vigorously compelled towards filling it in, towards attempt at actually knowing it. As we shall see, such filling in can cause rupture, schism, and controversy. The work of imagination is the work of filling in voids, of drawing unfinished patterns. That is how absence acquires its quality as a thing, like silence. Scholars of religious cultures are now exploring very seriously the workings of the mind. Everyone is working with the mind now, and the thing is to all find a friendly neurologist to work with if you're working in the humanities. But even before that became the done thing, anthropologist Pascal Boyer was quite keen to relate forms of religion to certain habits of the mind, certain cognitive structures in the human mind that had developed through the rough and tumble of evolution. Now he works more closely, and indeed it's evident in this here latest book, in fact, with neurologists in order to assess and determine why a specific forms, which are common in different religions, why specific forms are so common because they share certain types of congruence with neural pathways. In fact, Matthew Champion and I attended a lecture last year in Sweden where a young scholar tried to say that the rosary, you know, the devotional aid, the rosary beads, were such a success in early modern Catholic Europe because of, indeed, some sort of determinant habit of the mind that makes the rosary and its 50 beads and whatnot particularly suitable. That may be the case, but I find it more amenable and helpful, at least for the culture I shall be discussing, to think with the materiality offered by Mary Douglas, who has taught us to understand and think about the value of some particularly natural symbols, that is, symbols that are widely available and used within religious cultures, like the human body or the structure of the life cycle. And so, by looking at natural symbols, we also introduce the theme of loss and decay, just as we do themes of birth and thriving. Now, Christian cultural traditions are full of paradox, and I mean that in the rhetorical sense as well, antithesis. And living with paradox is living with absence, the absence of closure, the absence of certainty, the absence of rest. It is that tradition, cultural tradition of Christianity over quite a few hundreds of years, that we will go on now to explore more closely in its articulation, which is often in the form of filling in absences and plugging ambiguities. During the 4th century, around the Mediterranean, classical philosophy and letters merged with the teachings associated with the Judean prophet Jesus to create a Christian civic culture. It was enabled to flourish after 312 by the imperial edict of Constantine. Within the imperial sphere, it became the official religion, marked out with full majesty, authority, and with the power of the law to enforce. It was always also a local religion, articulated through the desires and aspirations and fears of individuals and communities. Peter Brown has shown magnificently how daily life in, say, 5th century rural Syria or Egypt rustled with the sacred. That's a typical Brownism, rustled with the sacred. You know what I mean, I suppose. Holy people, men in black, advised, consoled, and exemplified the faith in such communities. But in cities, the imperial presence played a defining role. It sought to imprint itself at the very heart of the Christian cultural system by defining the tenets of faith in great councils which were actually summoned and often chaired by the emperor, and by dictating the aesthetic of worship. Much of the liturgy, the vestments, the visual habits of priestly Christianity were indeed imperial in tone. The pictures are to connect to what I'm saying. Those of you who know that this is from Ravenna will be very pleased. Those of you who don't worry about it, because it would break the flow to introduce the exactitudes of each image, and I hope I've chosen them so that they fit perfectly into the argument. The highly evolved imperial aesthetic, then, offered a template for thinking about a God who triumphed over death, about his mother, like here, majestic, who bore a God within her, and about salvation as victory over sin. The absences within the historical legacy of Christian narratives, that is, within the Gospels, who don't at all tell Christians everything they want to know, were filled with content and aspiration over the centuries. Where the Gospels failed to answer, imagination did, through narrative. One of the most creative and formative areas of filling in the gaps was the provision of a backstory for Mary herself, for Jesus' mother, a genealogy, a family, a childhood. Mary had to be imagined as worthy of her mission, worthy of the son she was to bear. And so she was endowed with parents. This is not in the Gospels, but this is in a very rich tradition of narrative. She was endowed with parents, with a good Jewish family as a proper place to be born and milieu to be born in and grow in, with a devout and prosperous household, with nurture and care of her purity, particularly until the age of 3, when she could join her destiny as a maiden of the temple in Jerusalem in a life of purity, until she was next betrothed to that old widower Joseph, a single parent with 2 orphaned children, and the rest is Christian history. In the heated milieu of an emergent religion vying polemically with its surroundings, and that is, of course, above all, Judaism in Palestine, Syria, and Egypt, and with pagan religions in the Mediterranean cities, the Christian story was bolstered, supported in every way necessary, but by its followers, by this filling in of gaps and the answering of questions and awkwardnesses left open by the Gospels. The aim was, of course, to counter polemical derision and even just naive questioning by the curious. Questions like, so who was this mother of the man you claim to be the Messiah? And how did she, a woman, deserve her special fate? Absence filled in with human content now, with a tale about a home, a lineage, and the purity of Mary's virginal body as she grew, all knitted together with the established scriptural text. This process is very early indeed and is apparent in papyri, Greek papyri dating as far back as the 2nd century. It provided Christian cultures with some of the most beloved and often controversial scenes, narratives, and images that most Christians won't even know then or today are not scripturally endorsed, like, for example, the scenes of Mary's birth, that is the birth of Mary to her mother Anne, or the scene of her betrothal to Joseph there from the famous fresco by Giotto, or indeed, if you can see in that illuminated initial there, the story of her Assumption. All of this was the filling in of absence. If Mary was mother of an incarnate God, if God dwelt for a while within her body and then was born from it, then other questions followed too. As we have seen, the earliest and most urgent filling in of the gaps attached to questions about Mary's origins, but soon attention turned to her end. What could it have been like? There was utter revulsion at the thought that Mary, the human who had, by the mid-5th century, actually acquired this very important title, Theotokos, bearer of a god, not anthropotokos merely, bearer of a man, bearer of the full humanity and divinity of Christ combined. This too was controversial. Christians to the east, in areas of Syriac-speaking areas, for example, rejected this, but that's another story. So there was real revulsion at the thought that Mary, so exalted through her destiny, could just die like any other human, be buried in the ground and putrefy like all others. And so another end was imagined, one which saw her but falling asleep and being then assumed to heaven. By the year 500, literally tens, close to 70 narratives were available in several versions and languages of the Eastern Mediterranean, well, the Christian world mostly, the Eastern Mediterranean, in Armenian, in Coptic and Greek, and Syriac, and indeed in Latin. And according to them, Mary did not die. She fell asleep in what the Latinate version would call dormition, or in the Greek chymesis. And so, you see like there, in this here 10th century ivory, Mary falling asleep, the apostles all around her, and her soul being assumed in the hands of her son, or later on something like this, which is also the narratives emphasize the terrible mourning of the apostles and the very special privilege that her son accorded her. This understanding led to the creation of a related feast, which is evident already as early as the mid-5th century in the calendar of the Church of Jerusalem. The cultural work here created a heritage that was extremely powerful. So all this Mary heritage, beginning of life and end of life, was on the whole articulated most forcefully in the Eastern Mediterranean, which was the real powerhouse of both political power and theological discussion, of course, in a Mediterranean Mediterranean and Europe to be, that we're seeing a lot of unrest further west. And it created templates that were adopted in further west in what we will call Europe, really not without questioning, but really absorbed wholly as they were. So the image of Mary, like the one we saw before, that very frontal image, is the one that prevailed in Western Europe as far as Anglo-Saxon England for centuries. You see here an example of an ivory, a Carolingian ivory that is from the early 9th century with that sort of representation. Or you see here famously the Book of Kells, an insular British manuscript from around 800, again, Mary in this imperial mode, in this enthroned, majestic, frontal, unsmiling, official mode that was born in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 4th, 5th centuries, and which remained the stock presentation in Europe until around the year 1000. And it's at the end of that first millennium that European cultural traditions begin to change. And it's a really very interesting moment. And let us just think for a moment, what is this Christian Commonwealth at that time? Well, which we will call Europe. It does not as yet include areas like Livonia, Estonia of today, nor indeed much of Scandinavia. But it ranges from Ireland in the west to Poland and Bohemia and Hungary to the east. It includes Iceland from about the year 1000. And it is a moment from which we see a notable departure in Europe and within a Latin intellectual culture of new trajectories, new ideas, questioning, reformulation of almost everything that had come until that minute. And these discussions and elaborations, often fillings in of absences, occurred in the new hegemonic institutions of learning, debate, and law. These would include law courts of church and state, cathedral schools, universities, administrative tribunals, and indeed city councils. These were the forums for debate. You remember Zygmunt Bauman on Monday saying that these are the sort of forums of debate that we need, not for annihilation, but for actual rational conversation. So these are these types of forums, these types of a sort of version of some sort of public sphere. Now, these institutions developed in Europe in a period of extraordinary expansion. Between 1000 and 1200, the European population all but doubled. Political reach expanded, commercial activity intensified, and internal pacification was relatively enhanced. Much violence was exported and occasioned cultural encounters beyond Europe, as well as at its borders, like in Spain, Pomerania, the Baltic, and the Near East. All these trends combined to create one of the most remarkably creative periods in European history. This meant that intellectuals, and these could be theologians or lawyers or poets or monks, were engaged in a process of redefinition and exploration of all the inherited tenets that I've just mentioned from the earlier period and many of the related practices of European life. Unlike the earlier phase of cultural emergence of the 4th and 5th centuries, there was no obvious unifying political frame, such as the imperial had been at the time. Not until the papacy, that is, in the 11th century, made its bid to succeed as the wide-ranging purveyor of Romanitas for a Christian world, as the institution which determined morals and ethics and priorities. Now, Marek Tam, our gracious host, has studied most closely the emergence of this pan-European hegemonic institutional framework for the production, is particularly interested in how categories of truth and proof are produced. And this is, of course, central to any legal and political system. And he deals with the very institutions I shall refer to here, for they produced during the 12th and 13th centuries some fundamental tools for European Christian society. Its ethics, its narratives, and the demands it made on its members grew in their intensity and their fixity in law and bureaucracy. Solidarity was summoned through shared ritual experience, through salvation made palpable. And so increasingly, through discussion and ritual implementation, the most precise materiality was now cast upon a God who died on the cross, who was then resurrected and ascended to heaven. This was achieved through a ritual like no other, which offered union, physical, very material, to Christ's body, the Corpus Christi, historical, celestial, yet regularly present at every altar of Christendom. This was a promise, extraordinary and powerful. The Eucharist. And those of you who maybe aren't aware, this represents a priest in his vestments facing the altar, as was the custom at the time, at the moment after consecrating the bread of the Mass, the host, and raising it, now consecrated, now Christ's body, for all the congregation standing behind him to see. Very important moment. Through the debates of monks, the discussions of theologians, and the legislation of popes and bishops, a new mode for apprehending an absent God was devised. It saw the move from mere memory to real presence. Transubstantiation, it was called, from around 1180, that is the process by which mere bread and wine turned into the real, historical, absent, now present body of Christ. Figuring it out and teaching it to millions in the parishes was a real challenge and a feat of intellectual, pastoral, and organizational efforts. The memory of God, of his Last Supper, as told in the Gospels, and reenacted during, of course, the last days of Easter week, were all assumed within a new powerful immediacy of presence. For now it was taught without ambiguity that God was made present, summoned through the Latin words of the liturgy at every Mass, that the repetition of his own words, as recorded in the Gospels, "This is my body," was both a command and a promise, that his body, flesh and blood, came into being whenever and wherever the canon of the Mass was pronounced by a priest, and it didn't even have to be a particularly pious or worthy priest. And moreover, it taught that on rare occasions, once a year, Christians could receive this bread, now flesh and blood, in their bodies, through their mouth, ingest it, become one with it. Here was materialization. Here was presence of the highest order. Here was a past offered as palpable, to be savored. The efforts to make this promise convincing and consoling took the form of arguments, scriptural support, admonishing tales, a lot of preaching, but above all, it was the enhancement of ritual itself that did the job. The priest, of course, this is a period when the priests also become far more distinctive, separate ritual actors, with the celibacy now enforced, with expectations of higher training and learning, with the endowment of really important tasks in support of the sacramental religion put upon them. The performance of the Mass was attended by a whole range of material supports that appealed to the senses as well as to the emotions. It's really work of design and of knowing use of space. The fact that God was made present did not mean that access to him could just be undisciplined and uncontrolled. And of course, controlling, where there are a lot of people involved, is very difficult. So if you just look here at this image, for example, which describes the moment of the elevation sort of in profile, as it were, what you see is that there is this space around the altar. The altar is covered by cloth. There is the precious chalice on it and the book. There is a hanging that separates it off from the rest in order to avoid, intrusion of drafts and other types of intrusions into the space. You see there that there's an acolyte with a light kneeling behind the priest in order to mark the special space. And of course, there's a privileged layperson kneeling behind. In this here, you will see a more, let's call it a more sort of popular and populated scene, where you see again at this altar. If you notice, there's already an altarpiece. Altarpieces become very common throughout the 13th century. So he's raising the Corpus Christi in front of the crucified himself. Again, the chalice with its many layers of cloth. And you see to the left of the picture that chap over there pulling the bell that marks the moment of the elevation, and a whole congregation now of more modest people kneeling, and again, the light that marks the space between the altar and the congregation. So there's a whole etiquette of approach and appeal that came into being around the Eucharist. The Eucharist was kept in vessels made of precious metals, if some was left over, if the consecrated hosts of some were left over after the service. And they were tucked away in a space that could be approached by priests alone, like, for example, this here rather rugged remain of a Scottish cupboard in the wall there for the keeping of the remaining sacramental materials, or the rather grander sacrament house, this sort of rather elaborate Gothic confection from Courtrai in the Low Countries. When the Eucharist was carried in the streets and in processions or taken to the dying in their homes, again it was with the accompaniment of psalms and heralded by lights and with an etiquette about how to behave if you indeed met a priest's, that's a 17th century drawing, walking the streets with the Eucharist being taken to the sick or dying. It was often covered also by a canopy or a baldachin, actually just like kings were when they processed and entered into cities. So we see here a bishop carrying a monstrance with the consecrated host. This is a Corpus Christi procession, and with this canopy. So this whole etiquette of ritual that was powerfully there. So closely enmeshed, indeed, became the codes of the Eucharist and royal authority that it may not be surprising that Eucharistic orthodoxy also came to signify sometimes political loyalty. Conversely, rejection or doubt of the Eucharist, especially when this was pronounced publicly and made very unambiguous, came on some occasions to stand for political insubordination. So, for example, in around the year 1400, the very nervous usurper, King Henry IV of England, joined forces very knowingly with the church for the persecution, indeed, of those itinerant preachers known as Lollards, who taught that the Bible should be available, as it is here, in the English language to the laity, and who also questioned the whole carapace, the whole structure of exclusivity around access to the Eucharist. Or indeed, as happened in Bohemia in the 15th century, when the followers of Jan Hus, who you see burnt there on the left in 1415, when the followers of Jan Hus combined a frustration with the sort of German ecclesiastical authority through a critique, and you see their banner there that has a chalice on it, because they demanded that not only the priests be allowed to drink from the chalice at communion, at the Eucharist, because that was the custom, it was not given to the laity, but rather, again, questioning this whole set of sacramental arrangements. Now, I'm not saying that the Hussite wars were just about the chalice, but the chalice became a very useful symbol of the type of ecclesiastical power and indeed political power that they were challenging. Summoning past into present, predictably, reassuringly, materially, as it was through the sacrament, therefore, was a very powerful system of signification. It was always one that could also be challenged from various directions. All this meant that the process of summoning history into presence, past into present, and the material conditions of this summoning were dilemmas and challenges to be faced in every community, in public as well as in private. Nor were the resulting arrangements stable once they were pronounced and neatly legislated into canon law and entered into the books of liturgy. And so a whole area of cultural creativity developed, expressed in narrative and in visual imagery, and it aimed at supporting, explaining, convincing of the truth and possibility of God's past being indeed present and the absent made material in the Eucharist. This became the task and the vocation of some of Europe's greatest thinkers, including someone like Thomas Aquinas, who spent a lot of time thinking about it. Those who invested creative energy and emotion into making the system believable. One group imagined the Eucharist with particular aplomb, and these were religious women. Not only nuns, but women who devoted their lives to religion within urban communities or even after a fruitful life as mothers and wives. Such women appreciated in particular the union with the suffering, sometimes bleeding, Christ offered in images and, of course, at the altar, as Caroline Bynum has shown with great style. Women like here Juliana of Cornillon, a Béguine from the Diocese of Liège, had endless visions of the Eucharist and indeed claimed for months to have lived on nothing but the occasional Eucharistic wafer. The presence of the mother, of the Mary devotion that was growing alongside the sacramental one, emphasized for such religious women the maternal possibilities offered by the concentration on Christ's body. God's body was made available through the official and sanctioned rituals, but could also become a sort of plaything, such as here, with little dolls of the baby Jesus to be dealt with devotionally, but also how personally. That's a Netherlandish example from the area of Utrecht from the early 15th century, a devotional crib. The 14th century Swiss Béguine, Adelheid of Frauenberg, sought above all to serve the child Christ with her body. She imagined that. She removed her skin so it could serve as a diaper for our Lord, her veins to be made into a skirt, and imagined that her marrow be pulverized into a mash, that her blood into a porridge, and her bones be burnt in the fire, and her flesh would be consumed for all sins, and cried out from her heart that she be given a single drop of the milk of Our Lady which fed our Lord. Now, this is a set of just a series, a catena of emotional sort of imaginings of a sort of bodily nurturing of the child Christ. But it's very interesting in these communities of religious women to see the coexistence and indeed the convergence of the Mary maternal desire for the child and the fascination with the dying man on the cross. The imagined communion with God as a child, too, not only as a dying man on a cross, was inspired by the powerful new ways in which the foundation myth of Christianity, which imagined birth of a virgin, were recreated by Europeans in this period. Out of the monasteries and cathedrals of Europe, a nexus of intense liturgical performance and of engagement with classical and scriptural learning, came outpourings of new interpretations of that very myth of birth. From heroic, they became domestic. From distant God and majestic mother, they became much more palpable and familiar. So that we find not the Mary of majesty enthroned, but something like this being created in Europe. Mary looking at her son, a story of emotion, a narrative as between mother and child. Oh, that's a Parisian early 14th century ivory. Look here at this lovely stained glass from Herefordshire there again, with the child literally holding on to his mother's face in an attempt to show love and comfort and playfulness. The founding narrative soon came to include not just mother and child group, but family too. So we have a real elaboration and concentration on demonstrating that this was a holy family, mom, dad, and child, like here in this famous Simone Martini, right? Or there with mother knitting a garment that's 4-needle knitting. That's not a joke. And knitting, of course, the garment of salvation, which is also extremely symbolically and theologically pointed, a symbol of the incarnation. And increasingly with a very image of a very ordered, gendered household, one mum in one part, dad in the other part, each doing their job, and the little Jesus in his baby walker. And then this here little bourgeois household, mum and dad, same size, which is very interesting because size matters in these medieval representations. So this is a domestic scene. This is the Christian story at home with its believers, at least here in Northern Europe. And as I say, it becomes multi-generational with the powerful introduction of Saint Anne, that mother invented in the already mentioned the papyri from the 2nd century, that backstory of Mary now coming into her own, endorsing the family with another generation of nurture and comfort and support, and ultimately in the groups that became the absolutely most common decoration for parish churches in sort of Germany and Central Europe in the period, these wooden, painted, carved groups. And if you look at them closely, you will find Mary and her mother Anne, the little Jesus, then Mary's other husbands behind, because Anne's other husbands behind, because Anne was married 3 times, and all the cousins and relatives, a truly multi-generational family that some of our politicians would describe as dysfunctional. The clergy and religious who lived away from biological kin on the whole, some from a very young age, some from a later age, lived without that intimacy of familiar bodies and sounds, and they filled it, it seems, they filled this absence with the figure of Mary. And so from about 1100, a period of the greatest expansion in religious institutions, literally just the number of hundreds of new foundations in new orders, was also a process of creativity in words and sounds and materials. The absent mother, the absent sister and father were all created in the kinship of the Holy Family. And it grew in generations, as I've shown, as it exited from monasteries to become the stuff of parishes, as it moved from the Latin to the vernacular and affected the lives of lay people. To them, laymen and laywomen of Europe, it was not so much an absence filled, like it was for the monks and the nuns, but rather it was a field of emotion, prompted, heightened, and magnified by their own experiences. And where there is love, there is always loss and mourning. The 13th century began then a sentimental education of great creative power, one which is still with us. It staged the invasion of life by suffering in the crucifixion. Because the crucifixion, say in the 11th century, would look something like this when it was represented. It was sparse, there was Mary and John grieving, of course, but this is not a scene elaborated enormously as an emotional situation, as a scene of mourning, okay? But by 1305, in fact, in this case, part of Duccio's famous Maestà, this is what the crucifixion has become. And this is true for all over Europe, right? It's become populated with history. All these figures, some never mentioned, of course, in the Gospels, populating it. It is full of ethical import, implying on the right of Jesus, your left, the good group, Mary fainting in her suffering and pain, surrounded by the holy women and the Apostle John. On your right, Jesus is left, the bad side, the Jews baying for blood, the Roman soldiers, and so on. The visual met the textual and the musical, not the textual scriptural, but the textual devotional, because now preaching and devotional writing for the laity in the various vernaculars elaborated this story as a story of pain and suffering. Of course, it's followed by the resurrection, but that is not the point. The crucifixion was apprehended then and imitated in drama and in prayer. And above all, it concentrated on one relationship, mother and son. Son suffering, mother suffering with him. Lamenting, consoling, chiding. And these texts and these verses were all about exploring that relationship. It's as if sometimes regressing to a sort of baby talk between them as they explored the intimacies that they had learned, as it were, already at breast and childlike embrace. Yet for some Europeans, even an image like this, did not quite do a sufficient amount of work, did not provide the sort of intensity desired. And so we see around the year 1300 was born one of the most powerful images still in the European tradition, now gone global, which captures that moment of mourning. And that is, of course, the Pietà. It clearly relates to no scriptural text or moment, not even to any apocrypha, but it was imagined and desired, summoned out of absence into presence. It is the distillation of what had become the essence of the Christian story by the stage in European life, of pain and loss and mourning. Look at this here, amazing Bohemian example from around 1400. And then, of course, we all know that. It removed history. It removed the Romans and the Jews and the thieves and everything else. And it just distilled knowledge of pain, mother mourning her son. It was born in the southern Low Countries, probably, most probably, to accompany the devotions of those holy women already mentioned, the Beginen. It became the symbol par excellence of European, and as I said, now global, mourning. It was the chosen image for the Neue Wache in Berlin in the unforgettable form of Käthe Kollwitz's powerful sculpture. You'll remember Käthe Kollwitz herself had lost her son in the 1914-18 war, and when this was commissioned in the 30s, she already saw the clouds gathering over Europe again. And look here, in Samuel Aranda, the Spanish photographer's award-winning photograph from the Arab Spring in Yemen of 2011, an image that has inspired debate, but also attests to the power of the image of the Pietà, actually, because of its Marian resonance, to bring conversations to bear actually between Christians and Muslims, as the aftermath of this image and its receipt of the award show, if you want to follow it in the blogosphere. Now, as Zygmunt Bauman reminded us on Monday, early modern Europe tore itself apart over identity. He gave those horrible statistics for the wars of sort of 1500 to 1800. Religious sentiment and identity militated in many parts against the much-hoped fusion of horizons that we talked about also on the Monday. European culture became a zone of mourning and commemoration, with the grieving mother, a tormented God, and many dead grateful for prayers and good works in the alleviation of their purgatorial sufferings. These emotional and devotional habits forged certain types of political affiliations too. It victimized Jews as enemies of both Jesus and his mother. It encouraged harsh scrutiny of belief and practice. It provided dynasts with the justification for crusades and campaigns of revenge, for example, against the Hussites. And it offered foci for violence, as the wars of religion in the early modern period show. In the work of mourning, a strange collection of obituaries written by him for over dead friends, Jacques Derrida taught us that mourning creates debt. Deuil oblige. And I quote, "There come moments when, as mourning demands, deuil oblige, one feels obligated to declare one's debts. We feel it our duty to say what we owe to friends." That is to say, or that's what I take it to say, is that commemoration, commitments to the dead, to figures summoned from the past into presence, are occasions when our political commitments are most likely to be defined and affirmed. So we must worry and wonder and think about our own work of mourning and about the ghosts we conjure. For even if they deserve the service of memory as an act of justice and piety and love, they can also become our masters, living a second life in our own. Thank you very much.